I watched the terrified hitman drop to his knees, his trembling hands pressed against the cold marble floor, as he bowed to the clumsy, soft-spoken billionaire I was hired to protect. I didn't know it then, but the man I had been babying and defending for a month was about to show the entire city exactly what happens when someone threatens his personal bodyguard. "Look at her," he whispered, his voice a dark, vibrating threat that made my pulse short-circuit. "And you lose your eyes." Welcome back to Mimi's Afro-Korean Diaries. If you are addicted to fiercely protective men, intense K-drama plot twists, and heroes who wear a mask for the world but take it off only for the woman they love, hit that subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss a single second of this story. Let's dive in. The top floor of Ryu Global Enterprises was supposed to be the belly of the beast. My agency warned me that the CEO was an eccentric recluse who fired security contractors faster than he hired them. I stepped out of the private elevator, my heels silent against the polished concrete, fully expecting to meet a ruthless corporate tyrant. I mentally rehearsed my resume, keeping my posture rigid and my expression unreadable. Instead, my first sight of the most powerful tech billionaire in Seoul was him scrambling on his hands and knees. A massive stack of financial reports was scattered everywhere, covering a spilled ceramic pot. Rich, dark soil stained the pristine white floor, and right in the middle of the mess was Ryu Seung-ho. He was in his late 20s, wearing a flawlessly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my apartment. But he was currently using his bare hands to desperately scoop dirt back around the roots of a tiny, pathetic-looking fern. "No, please don't die," he muttered, his voice surprisingly deep but laced with genuine panic. He brushed a stray lock of dark hair out of his eyes, leaving a smudge of dirt right across his sharp cheekbone. I stopped in my tracks. This was the man who supposedly ran a multi-billion-dollar empire? He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a terrified intern who had just ruined his boss's office. I cleared my throat. "Mr. Ryu?" He jumped, his shoulder knocking into the sleek, dark walnut desk. The impact sent a heavy crystal paperweight crashing to the floor, missing his fingers by an inch. He scrambled backward, his dark eyes wide and frantic as he looked up at me. Up close, the sheer symmetry of his face was highly distracting. He had striking aristocratic features and full lips currently parted in shock. But his expression was soft, innocent, out of place in a room made of cold glass and steel. I tripped," he stammered, wiping his soiled hands on his expensive trousers, ruining the fabric. "The rug caught my shoe, and the poor plant was just collateral damage." I let out a slow, controlled breath. My protective instincts, the ones that usually kept me alive in hostile environments, instantly flared up. But not because he was dangerous, because he seemed too fragile to survive in a city like this. I took a step forward, dropping my leather portfolio onto a chair. "Let me help you with that before you cut yourself on the broken ceramic." He offered me a grateful, incredibly shy smile that transformed his face. The rigid tension in my shoulders began to relax. I leaned down to gather the scattered files, thinking this security detail was going to be nothing more than glorified babysitting. Then, a sharp metallic screech echoed from directly above him. I snapped my head up. The massive industrial steel lighting fixture suspended directly over Seung-ho's head ripped free from its ceiling mount. It wasn't a slow descent. Hundreds of pounds of metal and glass plummeted straight down, directly targeting the spot where he was kneeling. There was no time to yell. I didn't even think. I lunged. The screech of tearing metal was the only warning. I didn't hesitate. I threw my entire body weight forward, slamming into his solid chest and taking us both to the pristine floor, just as the massive steel chandelier crashed exactly where he had been kneeling. Glass shattered outward like shrapnel. I shielded his head with my arms, my breathing ragged. Underneath me, Seung-ho was trembling violently. His large hands gripped the fabric of my silk blouse, his pulse hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against my collarbone. "Are you okay?" I asked, pulling back just enough to check his face. His dark eyes were wide, overwhelmed by the chaos. He nodded slowly, clutching my arm like a frightened child holding a lifeline. The executive team rushed in seconds later, shouting in a panic. I was hired on the spot. They didn't even ask to see my references. They just needed someone willing to dive in front of falling debris for their fragile CEO. My first official day on the job proved exactly how vulnerable he was. We were standing in the middle of the crowded executive lobby when Director Min, a senior board member with a permanently sneering face, intercepted us. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. He marched right up to Seung-ho, shoving a heavy leather folder against the billionaire's chest so hard it forced Seung-ho to stumble backward. "You are an embarrassment to this company," Director Min snapped, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Sign the supply restructure, Ryu. Stop pretending you have the spine to run this empire. You're nothing but a lapdog keeping the seat warm." Seung-ho shrank back, lowering his gaze to the marble floor. His hands visibly shook as he reached for the pen. I had enough. My contract specifically covered physical security, but my instincts refused to let this arrogant bully humiliate a man who couldn't defend himself. I stepped smoothly between them, my hand landing firmly on Director Min's wrist before he could push the pen any closer. I applied just enough pressure to make the older man wince, holding his angry stare. "The CEO's schedule is full," I said, my voice low and devoid of warmth. "And if you ever step into his personal space aggressively again, I will consider it a physical threat. Step back." Director Min's face turned incredibly red, but the absolute certainty in my tone made him rip his hand away and storm off toward the elevators. I turned around to check on Seung-ho, finding him still looking down, rubbing his wrist, like he was deeply rattled by the confrontation. What I couldn't see, what nobody in the lobby noticed, was the way Seung-ho's eyes tracked the retreating board member over my shoulder. The trembling disappeared. The soft, terrified billionaire vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow stare that silently promised Director Min would not survive the week. The executive floor was abandoned by 11 o'clock. The only sound left was the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I stood by the glass walls of Seung-ho's office, watching him finally close his laptop. He rolled his broad shoulders, a movement that looked surprisingly fluid and powerful, before he caught me looking and immediately slouched, offering me that familiar, sheepish smile. "Everyone went home hours ago," he murmured, stepping out of his office. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, leaving the top 2 buttons of his crisp white dress shirt undone. "I know your shift ended at 8, Lyla, but the underground parking garage is so empty at this hour. I didn't want to walk down there by myself." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. The most powerful tech CEO in Seoul, claiming he was afraid of the dark. "That's what I'm here for, Mr. Yu. I will always make sure you get to your car safely." "Seung-ho," he corrected softly, his voice dropping an octave. "And since I kept you late, the least I can do is feed you." That was how we ended up sitting across from each other in the dimly lit employee break room, splitting 2 steaming bowls of instant, spicy ramen. The surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on me. He owned the entire skyscraper, yet he looked perfectly content eating convenience store noodles under fluorescent lights. The space between us felt impossibly small at that tiny table. The rich scent of the hot broth mixed with the faint, expensive aroma of smoked cedar radiating from his skin. I took a bite, looking up to find his dark eyes already fixed on me. He wasn't eating. He was just watching me with an intensity that made the room suddenly feel 10 degrees hotter. "You have a little..." He trailed off. Before I could reach for a paper napkin, he leaned across the small table. His large hand, the one I had seen trembling in the lobby just days ago, moved with absolute, flawless precision. His thumb brushed gently against the corner of my mouth, wiping away a stray drop of broth. He didn't pull back. His thumb dragged slowly, deliberately, across my lower lip. His skin was surprisingly calloused and incredibly warm. The breath trapped itself in my throat. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. For a terrifying, breathless second, the timid, clumsy billionaire vanished. He was replaced by a man looking at me with absolute, starving reverence, his intense gaze dropping to my mouth as the air between us grew impossibly heavy. Then, a loud, violent, mechanical clunk echoed through the walls. Every single light in the 60-story skyscraper died instantly, plunging us into absolute, suffocating darkness. The violent mechanical clunk that killed the lights in the break room sent us moving blindly through the dark corridors. I had guided Seung-ho to the VIP elevator, hoping the emergency power would hold just long enough to get us to the underground garage. The doors had barely slid shut behind us when the building's grid failed. The steel box plunged into absolute darkness, jolting to a terrifying halt the exact second we reached the basement level. My training took over immediately. High-rise corporate buildings had 3 layers of backup generators. A total, immediate blackout was never a coincidence. "Seung-ho, get to the back," I ordered, dropping my usual warmth for strict, tactical command. I grabbed the sleeve of his dress shirt, guiding his towering frame backward until his shoulders hit the rear wall of the elevator. I stepped squarely in front of him, turning my body into a physical shield as my hand hovered over the concealed holster at my hip. In the pitch black, I heard him let out a breathless, panicked sound. His large hands reached out, blindly finding my waist. His arms banded tightly around me, pulling me backward until I was flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, clinging to me like I was his only lifeline. But as the heavy seconds ticked by in the confined space, my heightened senses caught a glaring discrepancy. His hold on my waist wasn't desperate or frantic. It was a vice of absolute, calculated control. The long fingers gripping my sides weren't shaking at all. They were anchored, impossibly strong and possessive. And the broad chest pressed so intimately against my back? His breathing didn't match the terrified sounds he was making. It was slow, deep. His heartbeat was a calm, steady rhythm vibrating against my spine, resembling a predator waiting in the dark rather than a frightened victim. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from him was incredibly distracting. I opened my mouth to ask why he was suddenly so calm, but a harsh, metallic screech drowned out my words. The emergency grid finally surged. Dim amber lights flickered on, washing the tight space in a moody glow. Seung-ho immediately dropped his arms. His breathing abruptly shifted to ragged gasps as he shrank back against the wall, perfectly resuming the role of the terrified executive. Before I could confront the bizarre shift in his demeanor, a heavy iron tool wedged between the elevator doors. The thick steel plates were forcefully pried apart with a loud groan, revealing the shadowy basement parking garage. Standing just beyond the threshold were 3 men in dark, unmarked suits. Their posture radiated quiet, lethal violence, and the cold way their eyes locked onto us made one thing absolutely clear. They were waiting for us. The moment the gap between the heavy steel doors widened enough for a man to slip through, I moved. I shoved Seung-ho hard against the back panel of the elevator, drawing my tactical baton in the same fluid motion. "Stay down," I ordered over my shoulder. The first attacker lunged into the dim amber light. I deflected his grip, stepping inside his reach to drive my elbow sharply into his collarbone.
He dropped without a sound. The second man swung the heavy iron crowbar. I ducked, feeling the cold rush of air part my braids, and swept his legs out from under him. The brutal concrete floor handled the rest. But I was fighting in a confined space, and I was outnumbered. The third man was massive, and he bypassed me entirely. His cold eyes were locked on the corner where Seung-ho was cowering. The man reached inside his dark jacket, his hand emerging with a suppressed pistol. I scrambled to intercept, my boots slipping slightly on the polished floor. But I was a fraction of a second too late. Then, Seung-ho screamed. It was a loud, ungraceful sound of pure terror. He frantically scrambled away from the wall, his long legs seemingly getting tangled together. He pitched forward, his massive, broad-shouldered frame stumbling violently directly into the gunman's path. It looked like a blind, panicked fall, but the sheer force of Seung-ho's momentum slammed precisely into the attacker's center of gravity. The heavy impact launched the gunman backward, sending him crashing through the heavy fire exit doors positioned right behind the elevator shaft. The violent thud of the man tumbling down a steep flight of concrete stairs echoed endlessly in the dark. Seung-ho collapsed onto his hands and knees, gasping for air, staring down the dark stairwell in absolute horror. "I tripped," he stammered, his voice trembling violently as he rubbed his wrist. "Lyla, I swear my shoe caught the track. Is he dead?" My chest heaved as I stared at the crumpled heap at the bottom of the stairs. The timing had been flawless. The angle of the fall, the exact distribution of his weight to unbalance a trained killer. It felt too perfect. But looking at the billionaire shivering on the dirty concrete, his crisp white dress shirt ruined with dust, I forced my racing mind to push the impossible suspicion aside. "You're fine. Stay exactly where you are," I instructed softly, moving to inspect the closest unconscious man. I rifled through his dark jacket, searching for a corporate security badge or a hired contractor ID. Instead, my fingers brushed against something thick and cold. I pulled it out, angling it toward the flickering emergency lights. It wasn't an ID card. It was a heavy, matte black metal plate, deeply engraved with a coiled golden serpent. My blood ran cold. I recognized that crest from my international security briefings. This wasn't corporate espionage. This was the Bay Syndicate. Monsoon season arrived in Seoul with a vengeance, turning the evening commute into a chaotic blur of distorted neon lights and heavy downpours. I stood under the narrow glass awning of the corporate lobby, staring at the relentless sheets of water. My mind was still fractured from the underground garage incident 2 days ago. That golden serpent crest kept flashing behind my eyelids. To make matters worse, I had left my umbrella in my apartment. I braced myself to sprint for the subway station, but before I could take a single step, a towering figure stepped up right beside me. A massive, matte black umbrella snapped open overhead, instantly shielding me from the deluge. I turned to find Seung-ho standing impossibly close. He had traded his usual suit jacket for a heavy, dark cashmere overcoat that made his incredibly broad shoulders look even more commanding. Yet his expression remained soft, offering me that familiar, apologetic smile. "You are going to get soaked, Lyla," he murmured, his deep voice a smooth rumble beneath the chaotic noise of the storm. He didn't wait for my response. His large, warm hand gently cupped my shoulder, pulling me firmly against his side to ensure I was fully covered by the canopy. The sudden physical contact sent a rush of heat straight across my skin. The heavy, intoxicating scent of smoked cedar and fresh rain wrapped around my senses. Beneath the thick wool of his coat,
His body was a wall of solid heat, radiating a quiet, anchoring strength that contradicted his helpless billionaire persona. "I can handle a little rain, Seung-ho," I managed to say, trying to ignore how perfectly my frame fit against his. He looked down at me, his dark eyes tracing the curve of my jaw with a slow, focused intensity that made the air in my lungs back up. "I prefer to keep you safe from the storms," he replied quietly. We stepped off the curb together, moving down the flooded, abandoned sidewalk in tandem. The only sound was the heavy, hypnotic rhythm of raindrops hitting the taut fabric above us. But halfway down the block, a low, aggressive engine purr cut through the noise. A sleek, silver sedan materialized from the heavy curtain of rain, creeping slowly alongside us. It matched our pace perfectly, hovering just inches from the curb, before its pitch-black tinted window smoothly began to roll down. The men in the silver sedan hadn't been syndicate hitters. They were detectives. Now, less than 12 hours later, the silver badge of the Seoul Metropolitan Police gleamed harshly under the bright office lights of Seung-ho's suite. Two detectives sat across from the large executive desk, their expressions tight with mounting frustration. Seung-ho was performing his nervous routine flawlessly. His broad shoulders were hunched forward, and his long fingers anxiously tapped the edge of his tablet. He looked overwhelmed by the interrogation. "I really wish I could be of more help, Detective," Seung-ho stammered, his deep voice laced with genuine-sounding distress. "Director Min hasn't answered my calls in 3 days. I just assumed he was taking an unannounced vacation. He does that sometimes, when the board meetings get stressful." I stood perfectly still by the glass door, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. My face remained neutral, but my mind was racing. Director Min was the exact same board member who had aggressively shoved Seung-ho on my very first day. The same arrogant man I had physically backed down in the main lobby. Men with that much money and ego didn't just vanish without a trace. The lead detective sighed heavily, snapping his notebook shut and standing up. "If he contacts you, let us know immediately, Mr. Ryu. A man doesn't abandon his luxury car at the industrial docks just to take a vacation." They gave me a brief nod on their way out. As soon as the heavy glass doors clicked shut, closing us off from the rest of the floor, Seung-ho let out a long, shaky breath. He slumped back into his expensive chair, running a hand through his dark hair, making the strands fall in an endearingly messy way across his forehead. "That was terrifying," he murmured, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. "Do you think something terrible actually happened to him, Lyla?" I walked closer to his desk, my protective instincts violently clashing with a sudden, freezing spike of suspicion. The timing of the blackout, the highly trained men in the garage, and now a missing executive. It was too much of a coincidence. "I'm sure the police will figure it out," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. He offered me a small, incredibly soft smile, the kind that usually made my heart race for entirely different reasons. He reached across the wide desk to hand me the afternoon security manifest. As his arm extended, the crisp white cuff of his dress shirt pulled back just a fraction of an inch, revealing the heavy silver face of his exclusive designer watch. My breath stopped. I took the file, my eyes locking onto the intricate metal band circling his wrist. Wedged deep into the tiny silver grooves near the clasp, barely visible unless you were trained to look for it, was a distinct, dark smear of dried crimson. I felt out of my element. My tailored slacks and tactical boots had been replaced by a floor-length emerald silk gown that clung to my curves, slit high enough on the thigh to conceal the strap of my holstered sidearm. When I stepped into the private garage to meet him, Seung-ho was waiting by the town car in a razor-sharp black tuxedo. The moment he saw me, the polite, nervous smile on his face vanished. His breath hitched audibly in the quiet space. His dark eyes swept over me with a heavy, starving intensity that made the air suddenly feel incredibly thin, before he quickly blinked, cleared his throat, and resumed his usual shy demeanor. The corporate charity banquet was a sea of flashing cameras, clinking crystal, and Seoul's ultra-wealthy elite. I stayed half a step behind him, my posture rigid as I scanned the crowded ballroom. Seung-ho played his part flawlessly, shrinking away from aggressive investors, stammering through polite conversation, and keeping his head respectfully bowed. That was until a young, aggressively cologne-drenched heir from a rival development firm cornered us near the champagne tower. The man didn't even acknowledge Seung-ho's presence. Instead, he stepped directly into my personal space, his eyes raking over my dress with blatant, unapologetic disrespect. "Your boss is a coward," the heir slurred slightly, leaning in entirely too close. "Tell him to let you take the night off. You shouldn't be guarding a man who hides behind a woman." Without a fraction of warning, his heavy fingers clamped tightly around my bare arm. My muscles instantly coiled. I shifted my weight to my back foot, fully prepared to twist and snap his wrist in 3 different places. But before I could even pivot my shoulder, a large, warm hand clamped down over the heir's forearm. It was Seung-ho. He didn't stumble. He didn't stutter or look at the floor. The grip he had on the other man's arm was so terrifyingly rigid, so absolutely immovable, that the heir's arrogant smirk instantly dissolved into a grimace of genuine physical pain. Seung-ho stepped smoothly past me, using his towering, incredibly broad-shouldered frame to block the air from my view. The timid billionaire vanished into the shadows of the room. He leaned forward, bringing his face mere inches from the other man's ear. I couldn't hear what was said over the swell of the string quartet. It was just a single, softly spoken sentence. The heir's face drained of all color, turning a sickening ashen white. The sheer terror in his eyes was absolute. Seung-ho calmly released his grip, his expression blank. The younger man stumbled backward, gasping for air as if he had just looked directly at death itself, before turning and practically sprinting out of the crowded ballroom. I didn't wait to see if the arrogant heir would come back. I grabbed Seung-ho by the wrist, pulling him through the heavy velvet curtains and out onto the secluded terrace. The crisp night air hit my flushed skin, offering a brief distraction from the erratic rhythm of my heart. The balcony was empty, bathed in the soft, distant glow of the city skyline. I released his arm and turned to face him, crossing my arms over my silk gown to maintain whatever professional boundary I had left. "What exactly did you say to him?" I demanded, keeping my voice low. Seung-ho adjusted his black bow tie, his expression the perfect picture of mild confusion. "I simply reminded him of our corporate etiquette policies. He must have realized his behavior was inappropriate." "Corporate policies don't make a grown man look like he just stared directly into the abyss, Seung-ho." He didn't step back. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, erasing the professional distance between us. The sheer size of his broad-shouldered frame in that flawless tuxedo seemed to block out the city lights entirely. "He put his hands on you," Seung-ho murmured, his deep voice dropping to a smooth, vibrating frequency that sent a dangerous shiver down my spine. "I don't tolerate anyone disrespecting you, Lyla." "I am your security contractor," I reminded him, though my voice lacked its usual strict authority. "I am trained to handle hostile situations. I protect you, not the other way around." He took another step, my back pressed gently against the cold stone railing of the balcony. There was nowhere left to retreat. He raised his hand, his long, warm fingers gently tracing the sharp line of my jaw, right along the edge of my updo. His touch was incredibly soft, yet it carried an anchoring, undeniable authority that made my breath catch. "And who protects you, then?" he whispered. His dark eyes dropped to my lips. The timid, clumsy billionaire was nowhere to be found. The man standing in front of me radiated a quiet, magnetic dominance that left my highly trained instincts paralyzed. He leaned in, the intoxicating scent of smoked cedar wrapping around my senses, effectively dismantling every defense I had built. We were millimeters apart. I could feel the ragged warmth of his breath against my mouth. Every rational thought in my head screams at me to push him away and remember my job. But my body stubbornly refused to move. I tilted my chin up, surrendering to the pull between us. Before our lips could finally brush, a deafening crash violently shattered the quiet night. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows separating the terrace from the ballroom exploded outward in a blinding shower of broken glass. The elegant music of the string quartet was instantly drowned out by the chaotic, terrifying sound of 100 people screaming. The deafening crash of shattering glass instantly snapped me out of the trance. My highly trained instincts overrode the heavy romantic tension from just a second before. Screams erupted from the ballroom, mixing with the sharp, terrifying cracks of suppressed gunfire. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the lapels of Seung-ho's flawless tuxedo, pulling his massive frame violently to the left, just as a line of bullets tore through the space where we had been standing. I shoved him hard against the cold stone of a massive decorative pillar, shielding him from the line of sight. My hand dove beneath the high slit of my emerald silk gown, my fingers wrapping around the cold steel of my holstered sidearm. I drew the weapon in a fluid motion, clicking the safety off. "Keep your head down," I ordered, my voice stripping away every ounce of softness. I risked a quick glance around the edge of the pillar. The opulent charity banquet had devolved into pure chaos. Wealthy guests were scrambling for the main exits, tripping over expensive gowns and overturned tables. Moving systematically through the panicked crowd were 5 men dressed in dark, tactical gear. Their movements were precise, heavily coordinated, and focused on the terrace doors. This wasn't a random attack. It was a highly organized hit, and we were the targets. I pressed my back against the pillar, looking up at Seung-ho. He was breathing heavily, his dark eyes wide and frantic in the shadows. He looked paralyzed by the violence erupting just feet away from us. "Listen to me very carefully," I whispered, gripping his forearm to ground him. "I need to secure the service stairwell at the end of the terrace. It is our only blind spot. Do not move from this pillar. Do not make a sound. I will be right back for you." He nodded frantically, his hands gripping the edge of the stone so tightly his knuckles turned white. I broke away from the cover, sprinting low and fast across the dark terrace. The sharp adrenaline focused my vision to a razor's edge. I intercepted one of the tactical shooters trying to flank the balcony, disarming him with a swift, brutal strike to his knee and a heavy blow to his temple with the grip of my gun. He crumpled silently into the shadows. The service door was clear. It took me exactly 2 minutes to sweep the immediate perimeter and lock down a safe extraction route. "Seung-ho, the path is clear, let's move," I called out in a hushed, urgent tone as I rushed back to the decorative pillar. But the shadows behind the cold stone were empty. My heart stalled in my chest. I scanned the dark corners frantically, my weapon raised. He wasn't there. The only trace left of the helpless billionaire was his expensive black tuxedo jacket, discarded carelessly on the shattered glass of the terrace floor. My pulse skyrocketed the second I saw the empty black tuxedo jacket lying on the glass-covered stone. I had left him for exactly 2 minutes. A man like Seung-ho, someone who practically shook when a board member raised their voice, would never wander off during a live firefight unless he was violently taken. I abandoned my cover, keeping my weapon raised as I slipped through the heavy metal service door. The muffled sounds of screaming and shattered crystal faded behind me, replaced by the eerie, flickering hum of the corridor's emergency lights. I moved with absolute silence, clearing each corner with practiced precision, desperately searching for any sign of him. The hallway branched off toward the northern stairwell. I approached the heavy fire door, my boots making zero sound against the concrete. I pushed the door open just a fraction, angling my weapon forward. What I saw on the landing below made my mind flatline. Two of the masked tactical shooters were sprawled awkwardly on the concrete landing. They weren't moving. I kept my sidearm leveled as I carefully descended the steps, nudging the closest man with the toe of my boot. He was out cold, a massive, precise bruise forming just beneath his jawline. It was a strike designed to sever a person's equilibrium in a single hit. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. I knelt to inspect their weapons. The heavy, suppressed rifles hadn't just been dropped in a chaotic struggle. They were flawlessly dismantled. The magazines were ejected and tossed into the corner, the heavy steel bolts removed, and the upper receivers cracked open. This wasn't the sloppy aftermath of a panicked fight. This was the terrifyingly calm, systematic destruction of enemy firepower by someone with elite training. Someone who knew exactly how to render a weapon useless in less than 5 seconds. My thoughts scrambled to make sense of the scene. The only people on this floor were terrified charity guests and the hitmen themselves. The clumsy, soft-spoken billionaire I was hired to protect couldn't possibly have done this. I stood up slowly, the cold draft of the stairwell suddenly feeling oppressive. I needed to find Seung-ho, right now. I turned toward the narrow maintenance corridor leading off the landing. The shadows there were thick, untouched by the amber emergency lights. I took one step into the dark. Before my eyes could even adjust, a massive arm shot out from the pitch-black void. A large, calloused hand clamped firmly over my mouth, cutting off my sharp gasp. I tried to pivot, bringing my weapon up to strike, but a second arm wrapped like an iron band around my waist, lifting my feet off the concrete floor. The sheer, overwhelming strength of the grip was terrifying. I was dragged backward into a pitch-black utility closet, the heavy metal door clicking shut, swallowing me into the dark. The pitch-black darkness swallowed my frantic struggle. I twisted hard against the iron grip holding me, fully prepared to drive my elbow backward and shatter a jaw. But a familiar, heavy scent immediately flooded my senses. Smoked cedar. "Lyla, stop. It's me." A deep, trembling whisper brushed against my ear. The arms around my waist loosened just enough for me to turn around in the cramped, airless space of the utility closet. Seung-ho. He was breathing in ragged, uneven gasps, his broad chest rising and falling heavily against mine. Without his tuxedo jacket, the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt radiated an impossible amount of heat in the cold room. "Seung-ho?" I breathed, lowering my sidearm slightly but keeping my finger near the trigger guard. "How did you get down here? I told you to stay behind the stone pillar." "I panicked," he stammered, his large hands finding my shoulders in the dark, gripping me like he was afraid I would vanish. "The gunfire was so loud. I just ran. I found this door and hid. I thought they had you." His voice cracked with what sounded like genuine terror. I wanted to ask about the flawlessly dismantled tactical rifles on the landing. I wanted to ask how a terrified executive managed to slip past highly trained shooters without making a single sound. But in the suffocating darkness of the closet, every rational question in my mind began to melt away. The space was too small. My back was pressed flush against a metal shelving unit, and Seung-ho was standing so close that there was absolutely zero space between us. My emerald silk gown offered no barrier against the solid, muscular wall of his chest. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hands slid slowly from my shoulders down to my waist, anchoring me in the dark. The terrified billionaire routine was contradicted by the deeply possessive, heavy way his long fingers rested against my hips. He lowered his head,
his breathing ghosting across my neck. The danger waiting outside the heavy metal door faded into the background, replaced by an intoxicating, magnetic gravity that made my knees feel unreliable. "Are you hurt?" he murmured, the trembling in his voice gone, replaced by a smooth, vibrating intensity that demanded my full attention. "No," I whispered back, trapped in the heavy tension pulling us together. Before he could close the final fraction of an inch between us, a sudden, harsh vibration shattered the quiet intimacy. A sharp, blinding blue light illuminated the tiny closet. It was coming from the pocket of Seung-ho's tailored trousers. He froze, his jaw tightening as he slowly reached down and pulled out his private cell phone. In the stark glow of the screen, his soft, terrified expression vanished, leaving behind a cold, lethal mask. I glanced down at the bright display illuminating the dark space. The caller ID flashing on the screen wasn't a worried board member or the police. It read, Chairman Bay. A chilling wave of confusion washed over me. Why would the ruthless head of a rival syndicate be directly calling the private, unlisted cell phone of the tech CEO he was currently trying to assassinate? Seung-ho didn't answer the flashing phone. His thumb swiped across the bright screen, instantly killing the call and plunging the tiny utility closet back into suffocating darkness. Before I could demand an explanation for why the head of the city's most dangerous syndicate was calling a supposedly fragile tech CEO, a deafening,
mechanical grinding noise violently shook the floor beneath our feet. I knew that sound. It was the absolute worst-case scenario. Heavy, reinforced steel security shutters were slamming down over every single exterior window and door of the massive corporate estate. The loud, final clangs echoed through the concrete walls like a prison door locking shut. The Bay Syndicate hadn't just ambushed the charity banquet. They had hijacked the building's central mainframe and triggered a total lockdown. We were trapped inside. My mind raced through my tactical options, but the mathematics of our survival were terrifyingly bleak. I had a standard issue sidearm and exactly one extra magazine. Outside this metal door was a highly coordinated private army sweeping the floor, carrying suppressed rifles and wearing body armor. I was highly trained, but I could not fight a war alone, not while trying to keep a civilian alive. I pressed my ear against the cold metal door, listening to the heavy, deliberate footsteps of tactical boots echoing in the corridor. They were getting closer, sweeping the rooms one by one. I turned back to Seung-ho. He was just a dark silhouette standing a few inches away, but I needed to keep him focused. "Listen to me," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly steady to mask the cold rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. "When they breach this door, I'm going to push forward and draw their fire. You have to stay low and move exactly when I tell you. I promise you, Seung-ho, I won't let them touch you." I raised my weapon, bracing my shoulder against the doorframe, fully prepared to sacrifice everything to get him out of this building safely. But the frantic, heavy breathing behind me had stopped. The terrified executive who had been clinging to my waist just moments ago was gone. In the heavy, tense silence of the dark closet, I heard him let out a slow, deeply exhausted sigh. When he moved, there was absolutely no clumsiness, no hesitation. He stepped right up beside me, his towering frame blocking my line of sight to the door. The timid slouch evaporated, replaced by a rigid, imposing posture that radiated absolute, lethal dominance. "Lyla," he said. The sound of my name made my breath stall in my chest. His voice had transformed, The soft, nervous stammer was replaced by a dark, vibrating command that held zero fear. He slowly reached out, his large hand wrapping firmly over mine where I gripped my sidearm. "Give me the gun." I stared at his large hand covering mine in the dark. My brain struggled to process the command. The man who had tripped over his own feet in the parking garage, the man who constantly needed me to walk him to his car, was suddenly speaking with the chilling authority of an apex predator. "No," I whispered, tightening my grip on the heavy steel of my sidearm. "You don't know how to use this, Seung-ho. I am not letting you go out there." He didn't argue. He didn't stutter, and he certainly didn't back down. Instead, Seung-ho took a half step forward, eliminating the remaining millimeter of space between us. His thumbs slid smoothly over my knuckles, pressing precisely against a sensitive nerve just below my wrist. The subtle, highly calculated pressure forced my fingers to involuntarily loosen. Before I could even gasp, he stripped the weapon from my grasp. It wasn't a clumsy grab, it was a flawless, tactical disarm. I stood frozen, my empty hands hovering in the dark as the final pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in my mind. The meticulously dismantled rifles in the stairwell, the perfectly timed trip in the garage that had sent a hitman tumbling down the concrete stairs, the single whisper that had terrified an arrogant corporate heir into fleeing a ballroom. He had never been afraid. He had been playing a part, hiding in plain sight. In the faint ambient light filtering under the heavy metal door, I watched the fragile billionaire evaporate. Seung-ho handled my sidearm with a terrifying, fluid grace. He didn't even need to check the safety. His fingers naturally registered it was already disengaged the second he gripped the frame. He didn't nervously search for the magazine release. Without even looking down, he expertly racked the slide back just a fraction of an inch to press-check the chamber, the metallic click echoing sharply in the confined space. His dark eyes finally met mine. The sheer intensity radiating from him was unrecognizable. This was a man who ruled empires in the dark. "I hired you because I wanted you close, Lyla," he murmured, his deep voice a smooth, vibrating promise that made my pulse race uncontrollably. "Not because I needed protection." He reached out, his free hand gently brushing a stray braid away from my cheek. The contrast between the cold, lethal weapon in his right hand and the incredibly tender, devoted touch of his left scrambled my senses. "Stay behind me," he commanded softly. Before I could form a single word in response, the heavy, muffled footsteps in the corridor abruptly stopped directly outside our room. The heavy metal door of the utility closet violently exploded inward, kicked open with enough force to shatter the hinges, instantly flooding our tiny sanctuary with harsh light and the imposing silhouettes of 3 heavily armed men. The heavy metal door tore off its hinges, crashing into the concrete corridor with a deafening screech. Harsh fluorescent light flooded our tiny sanctuary, casting the imposing silhouettes of 3 heavily armed men across the floor. They raised their suppressed rifles, the red laser sights slicing through the dust. I braced myself for the crossfire, but the man standing in front of me didn't flinch. Seung-ho moved. It wasn't a desperate scramble. It was a terrifying exhibition of absolute, calculated violence. He stepped into the blinding light with a chilling calmness. He didn't even fully extend his arm. He simply raised my sidearm and fired. The sharp cracks of the handgun echoed violently in the confined space. 1, 2, 3. The entire engagement lasted exactly 4 seconds. I stood frozen against the back wall,
my ears ringing violently from the unsuppressed gunshots. The 3 tactical shooters were sprawled motionless on the cold concrete outside the doorway. They hadn't even managed to pull their triggers. Seung-ho stood over them, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a slow, controlled rhythm. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look relieved. He looked unfazed. He expertly popped the magazine to check the remaining rounds, slapped it seamlessly back into the grip, and slid the weapon into the waistband of his trousers. The sharp scent of burnt gunpowder now mixed heavily with his smoked cedar cologne. Slowly, he turned around to face me. The harsh corridor light illuminated him perfectly. His crisp white dress shirt strained against the thick muscles of his chest. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the chaos, falling over eyes that were now hollow, lethal, and impossibly dark. The timid, plant-loving billionaire I had spent the last month protecting was an illusion. The man standing before me was an apex predator who had just effortlessly dismantled a hit squad without a single drop of sweat. My mind struggled to reconcile the terrifying executioner in the doorway with the man who had trembled in a dark elevator just hours ago. He owned the tech company, but looking at the cold, untouchable authority radiating from his towering frame, it was undeniably clear that he owned the entire underground, too. He stepped back into the utility closet, closing the remaining distance between us. The dangerous, icy mask on his face softened the absolute second his eyes locked onto mine. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently wrapping around my trembling hand. "I am sorry I lied to you, Lyla." His deep, vibrating voice echoed in the quiet,
Smoke-filled air. He lifted my hand, pressing his lips softly to my knuckles, while his dark eyes held mine with an intense, burning devotion that left me paralyzed. But nobody hunts what is mine.